it.
Hi, Joe.
Hi, Jackie.
It's been a busy day for both of us, but now we're here.
That's right. Well, we have families and work and all kinds of things to adjust. Yes, that's
okay.
Right.
So this is going to be a tour d'horizon of Iran-related issues, and there's a bunch of things that happened this week that we want to get to, beginning with the testimony on the Hill of General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker, which contained some really pointed language about Iran, a slight departure from where the administration's been recently, and appearing to really up the ante, talking about a proxy war with Iranian forces. What's your take on that?
I think this took all of us by surprise. It'd be one thing if it was just Senator Lieberman beating this Iran threat drum again. He's done this repeatedly. He said that Iran was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans. Now, if that was true, well, that's a cause for going to war with Iran. Hundreds of Americans. But he said this kind of thing repeatedly. It doesn't get much traction. What was different is that General Petraeus seemed to confirm that this time, was nodding in agreement, said that, yes, Iran is a threat. And Crocker, someone who's not seen as political as either Lieberman or General Petraeus, seemed to confirm this as well. And then the president comes out the next day and gives a new rationale for why we're in Iraq. And he says that we're in Iraq because it's there that we confront the two greatest threats to America, Al-Qaeda and Iran. So this clearly seems to be the start of a new effort, apparently coordinated and endorsed by the neoconservatives who are right out with their op-ed saying, see, Iran's a threat, a new effort to both justify the U.S. presence in Iraq and perhaps lay the groundwork for military action against Iran. Yet again, build up to possible action.
So two things here. One is, what we didn't hear in this testimony is any new evidence presented. Clearly there appear, well, actually, Petraeus and Crocker did not present any evidence about direct Iranian support for Shia proxies in Iraq, unless I'm mistaken about that, but I don't think I heard of any. So that's one issue. And then the second issue is, what has really changed on the ground to warrant this in the post-NIE environment? So, post-NIE, what's changed in sort of the Iran-Iraq situation? And on the nuclear front, there have been a couple of changes, but nothing really earth-shattering. So do you think this is a last-ditch effort by Cheney and neoconservatives to beat the war drums, or do you think that there's something more going on?
There is no evidence that anything has changed, despite the fact that the press has sort of fallen into this. And this is really where you have to fault our top journalists. I read the Associated Press report today, Saturday, about this, and it says U.S. officials say Iran hikes aid to Shia. And the top paragraph says U.S. officials say that Iran has increased its assistance. But when you look at who they're quoting, they quote Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, and he's saying, all he says is there is a sense that there may be some increase in aid, but we don't know for sure. So as far as I can see, as far as the public has been presented, there's no new situation on the ground. There's no evidence of an increased shipments by Iran to the Shia militia they support. The only thing that's changed on the ground is that the intra-Shia part of this Iraqi civil war has intensified as Prime Minister Maliki has launched attacks against his rivals in the Shia community. Remember, this has nothing to do with al-Qaeda. This has nothing to do with attacks on U.S. forces. This is an inter-Shia rivalry that we're being drawn into.
Well, now the other thing that's puzzling in this kind of uptick in rhetoric is that the calendar is getting very short for any kind of action. I can't imagine. I mean, what is the window between now and November? Because I can't imagine in the transition period, unless there was a radical casus belli on the part of Iran, but I can't imagine that would be the time for any kind of military action. So really, it's between now and November, and that's 6 months.
Yeah, I can't imagine that the U.S. is actually going to launch a strike against Iran. I actually do believe that basically this is another example of what you and I talked about last time we discussed these issues was threat inflation, inflating the threat in order to justify policies that otherwise the American people wouldn't support. So when you look at what the president said, that our two greatest threats are Al-Qaeda and Iran, I mean, Iran, it doesn't rank up in my top 5 threats to America. I would say that the number one, the threats we face that are most urgent are nuclear terrorism, global warming, the deepening global economic crisis, related to that, global poverty. All of these threaten our security, threaten our stability. Iran doesn't play in that at all. Our presence in Iraq doesn't play in that at all. And even when you look at the threat of Al-Qaeda, it's not that the Shia, Sunni group in Iraq that calls itself Al-Qaeda in Iraq that's the danger. It's Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. That's where the real threat is. That's where Osama bin Laden is. That's where Osama bin Laden is closer to a nuclear weapon than he ever has been. Iraq has nothing to do with that. In fact, is probably diverting us from going after the real threats. So we've got to be very careful when politicians try to frame the threat issue this way. To get us to see the threat in a certain way, we have to step back and make our own analysis, make our own judgments.
Let's shift for a moment to the other important news out of Iran. And that is in the last week that Ahmadinejad, on Iran's National Nuclear Day, it's a national holiday apparently, declared that Iran was going to be installing 6,000 more centrifuges in Natanz. So this got everybody's attention. Of course, right away we, tried to figure out what was really happening and understand it. And to the best of my understanding, Ahmadinejad's misspoken. He's overstated things in the past. We know that. But to the best of my understanding, Iran is kind of inexplicably in the process of installing a second module of 3,000 cascades at Natanz of the P1 variety. When this report came out, there was confusion. Is this the modified P2, more advanced centrifuge? Why would they install a P1? Those machines don't work all that well, we know. Why would they invest the time and effort to do that? Then there was some conflicting reporting by wire reporters that maybe this was yet a third type of centrifuge. The bottom line is we don't really know. We haven't heard definitively from the IAEA. And when I say we, I suppose I'm talking about the non-proliferation community that follows this closely, and myself and David Albright in particular. We don't know definitively what centrifuge is being installed, but our understanding is that it's a P1. And this is a little head-scratching because this machine doesn't work so well.
Yes.
Why would they...
First of all, maybe you should explain to people what a P1 is.
A P1 is the centrifuge designed, the early 1970s era centrifuge designed by the Dutch and stolen by A.Q. Khan and brought to Pakistan, and it became sort of the basis for Pakistan's centrifuge uranium enrichment program, and then was adopted by Iran. And this design has been improved upon many times. I think now Urenco's centrifuges operate at least an order of magnitude. I mean, it's sort of...
Right.
It's the term of art is a separative work unit. This is sort of the way you measure a machine. And
right, so a modern centrifuge is 10 times more efficient, even 100 times more efficient.
I think it's 100 times. So the P1 is sort of, I think I've described it as the Pinto of the, when the car guys, they're like, should we tow should we use a Pinto to tow something? And they're like, no. So you shouldn't use a P1 if what you really want to do is enrich a lot of uranium quickly.
Right, and you put out a report that indicates, based on the IAEA reports, that their existing centrifuge facility, the 3,000 they have, aren't working very well, at least not up to their design capability.
Right, and right. So the P1 has, first of all, a limited design capability, and Iran isn't even working up to that. And there are all kinds of reasons for this, and there are also lots of things we just don't know, because the IAEA, when they go into Natanz, they're allowed to look at the uranium hexafluoride that flows into the cascade, and they can check the output. But the inner workings of the cascade and the processes, those are considered confidential. And in any country that the IAEA conducts safeguards inspections, they're not allowed to sort of get in deep to the centrifuge cascades and how they're working. That's sort of proprietary information. Anyway, so there's just stuff we don't know about why things aren't working as optimally as they should be. Nevertheless, they're not, and Iran's going forward in what I can only conclude is sort of a political statement to create facts on the ground, to sort of create the perception that its program is more advanced than it is in reality, and that's, achieving something. And they are, at the same time, doing work on this more advanced centrifuge, and that's important, too. So
Let me ask you a question about this, because I was looking at the calculations you make, and am I right that they are producing, Iran is producing low-enriched uranium at this point, but it is about 10% of what they would be producing if these machines were operating at full design capability? Because I thought the IAEA report said they produced about...
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no. I don't know if the magic number is 10%, but you're right. It's something along... It's maybe slightly higher than 10%, but it's around that. And there's, not to get into too much detail for this discussion, but there is some. The Iran made a statement before they began installing large numbers of centrifuges about how they would work, and basically the formula would be that they would produce 10. They would have a 10% product rate. It appears that this formula that we've all been using to create our to base our assessments on is not accurate. So there's some technical issues with how people are even doing their assessments.
So when you look at this, you had done an assessment a while back that said worst case scenario, Iran might be able to make enough material for a nuclear weapon at the end of 2009.
Right, and we need to now we're at the point where we need to revise that, because it would be 2010 at the earliest, based on what we know now.
So stretch it out so that they're not doing as, in other words, they're not doing as well as we feared they might.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So again, this gets us back to the beginning of the conversation. Is Iran a threat? Yes, they're a threat. Is their program a problem? Absolutely, it's a problem. Is it the kind of imminent threat that would justify either the presence of U.S. forces in Iraq or military action against Iran? And the answer is, to me, absolutely not.
Right, absolutely not. Except here's the one thing, and this is also troubling. ISIS released yesterday notes that were taken at a briefing given by the IAEA's Deputy Director of Safeguards, Ali Hainonen, a briefing in February of diplomatic missions, including Iran, of some of the documents that it had in its possession detailing Iran's activity related to weaponization, research and development.
Right, that briefing made headlines.
Made headlines, and so the notes were taken by diplomats, and the notes that we published were apparently by no means a verbatim account of the meeting, and should have to be read that way, but clearly present some very troubling information about work that Iran was engaged in.
Like?
And most, not all, but it appears that a great deal of the information presented to diplomats is drawn from this so-called laptop that was acquired through an intelligence operation, I believe run by Germany, and which was exploited, and a great deal of documents, including sort of a movie, a film of some kind, obtained and analyzed. And the IAEA, I don't want to quote from this, people will link to it, people can read it, but one of the things is this so-called reentry vehicle, which is designed to explode at an altitude of 600 meters. This is sort of consistent with the design that a nuclear warhead would have. The IAEA concluded that the possibility it was designed to accommodate conventional explosives or chemical or biological charges was excluded. So they said, basically the IAEA said, based on what we see, this is really only about a nuclear device. And that's... Go ahead.
But what is this? The problem is that this so-called laptop of death, that's how a lot of the bloggers refer to it, has been provided by U.S. intelligence.
And there's the rub. That's the problem.
And because nobody trusts us. I would say they don't believe us.
Credibility.
There's just a tremendous credibility gap that has grown up. Particularly since it was shown that most of the intelligence used to justify the war in Iraq was made up, or was based on dubious sources, agents that were trying to justify a war with Iraq that they wanted, but the evidence they provided wasn't real. So the question is this evidence real? Did the U.S. intelligence services make it up? Did some Iranian dissident group make it up? And so if this is the case against Iran, it may be that these documents are genuine, but nobody can believe that they are.
Well, just two other quick things. The IAEA provided information from other sources, not just the laptop of death. That's one thing. And the second thing is, you're absolutely right about the credibility gap. It's really problematic. It does seem that the IAEA, at least in examining these, is of the view that they're taking it seriously. Iran, of course, important to note, denies it totally, says the documents are fabricated, and refuses to really even engage on this. And apparently there was even some, at the meeting itself, the Iranian diplomat present took out his cell phone camera and was recording part of the briefing and objecting to it loudly. It got a little tense in the room, apparently. Was
this Ambassador Sultaneh?
Is he? I can't.
He's a pretty belligerent sort. I can imagine him doing that.
Yeah.
But let me ask you something about this. I actually believe that Iran did do work on nuclear weapons in the past. I think the evidence is circumstantial, but it's pretty strong that there was some nuclear weapons activity in the past. But that I concluded, as the NIE did in November 2007, that this work stopped, more or less around 2003, and maybe not completely, but in the main. And do these documents, insofar as they refer to this weapons work, is this weapons work that was done in the past, that is before 2003? Well,
there's a little disconnect on that. The documents actually indicate that the timeline continued into 2004. So we're basically talking 2003, 2004, leave it at that. The other troubling thing is that Iran still has not granted the IAEA access to one of the names of people that appears throughout this. His name is Fakhrizadeh, Dr. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. Apparently at the head of an important part of this program, and also establishes linkages between the military and the civilian side of Iran's nuclear bureaucracy. So Iran still has a lot of...
Right, and why do you think that is?
Why haven't they granted access to him?
Right.
Because they're denying. I mean, Iran's position is deny.
This guy did do weapons work in the past, and if they give you access, their story's going to be exposed. I mean, I think they're caught in this trap.
Right.
That they did do these things. They stopped them more or less, in the middle of this decade. Their weapons program is actually the fuel enrichment program now. They're trying to do the hardest part first, try to do it openly and legally, but they're caught. If they admit what they did in the past, then they're afraid that the U.S. will use that as an excuse for military action or tougher sanctions. So for me, the answer is you've got to find a way to keep the pressure on Iran, but give them a way out.
Okay,
give them a way out to admit what they did in the past, the way Libya admitted what it did in the past, and the way North Korea is slowly admitting what it did in the past. And that's what our policy hasn't done.
All right, so let's segue to the problem with the policy. And, my diagnosis of this is that, well, there's obviously a problem with the policy. There's a huge problem with the administration, which has just failed so miserably on every level. Iran has eaten our lunch on this issue at every step of the way. But you and I were talking earlier about this cleavage that sort of exists within the disarmament and arms control world. And I was suggesting that maybe the next I'll explain what I think the cleavage is. There are, I don't want to speak for you, but those who suggest that we need to acknowledge what Iran has done, limit its enrichment program to the greatest extent possible, have the maximum amount of IAEA monitoring and inspections, etc., but at the same time learn to live with a little bit of enrichment, because that's just the way it is. Would you say that accurately captures one side of the community on this issue?
Yes, I would, and that is more or less my position.
Okay, and then on the other side, and for the sake of this discussion, I'll ally myself with the other side. That a little bit of enrichment is way too much, and we shouldn't put ourselves there. And so what I want to ask you about is whether maybe, if we want to be really idealistic with the assume Democratic administration coming to power, can't assume anything, but if it does happen, might there be an opportunity for these two groups to come together and come together over agreement, where we all share agreement that if we're going to make the argument that enrichment is a bad thing for Iran and lots of other countries to have, we're going to need to show those other countries that the nuclear haves are really serious about undertaking their commitment under the NPT for nuclear disarmament. People call it the Article 6. We don't want to bore people about Article 6, but the Article 6 part of the NPT that says you gotta get rid of your nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And so hang tough on not seeing the fuel cycle spread, but do our part to advance disarmament. What do you think about that? Too idealistic?
You see, no, I think it's realistic. I mean, I think this idea that realism means using military force has got to be adjusted. Realism means understanding the difficult situation you're in and plotting a practical way out of it. We are in a deep hole with Iran. This administration has screwed this up so badly that there is no quick solution to this. Remember, when the Bush administration took office, Iran didn't have operating centrifuges. They did not have a uranium conversion facility operating at Esfahan. They did not have a radical revolutionary president preaching death and destruction to Israel and the United States. We were in a much better situation. And in fact, Iran helped us in the war with Afghanistan, helped us stand up the Karzai government, was glad to see the U.S. overthrow the regime in Iraq, and came to us in April 2003 with a proposal for how to settle all these issues, including their relationship with Hezbollah, including their relationship with Iran. We rejected it. This administration thought it could solve the problem by eliminating the regime. This policy has been a disaster. Iran is a much bigger problem for us now than they were when this Bush administration took office. And what we have to hope for is that the administration doesn't screw it up anymore before they leave.
Well, so
when I started dealing with the Iran situation, as I started this enrichment proceeding, I was with you. I thought, no enrichment. Our position has got to be no enrichment. Well, I'm sorry. We're past that.
Right.
These guys got 3,000 centrifuges. There is no way any administration in Iran is going to stop spinning those centrifuges, at least at first. So we have to approach this in a staged manner.
So here's my plan. I have a plan for how we get them to stop spinning the centrifuges.
Okay, go.
Okay, my plan is, number one, direct talks, no preconditions,
Check.
the U.S. involved. Number two, we really kind of gaze deeply at ourselves and ask if we're serious about regime change in Iran, understand that that's not in the cards, now probably never, and give Iran some type of security assurances, maybe of the kind that were used with North Korea.
And that is the basis of step one. Iran's not going to enter into this negotiations if they believe that we still harbor ideas of overthrowing the regime. So 1 and 2 are almost, they're closely linked. The precondition, if you want it from our side, is that we have to signal to them that if this works out at the end of the process, there is a security arrangement that we can arrive at.
Right.
Okay,
so talks with them. Okay. Then you've got to really, bring back the EU proposal from June 2006, which is very detailed, very interesting, advanced light water reactor technology, lots of carrots, up the carrots, talk about trade, talk about long-term relationships, bringing Iran, incorporating Iran more into the, Western economy and oil and gas, infrastructure,
I would say there's plenty of carrots on the plate.
Lots of carrots.
That's a great deal for them, and you know that there's some pragmatists in Iran who want that deal.
Right, and
in
a way, to me, that deal kind of calls Iran's bluff a little bit about how serious it is about having a peaceful civil nuclear program to generate energy. Because if this is about energy, let's make it about energy. Let's build 25 reactors. Let's light up your grid, and so keep them serious about that. And then the other thing is, simultaneously to that, and this is my big plan. The U.S., and this will have to be in another administration, gets really serious about addressing regional issues that are very hard, difficult to talk about. The Arab-Israeli issue. It's, put it on the table. Talk about Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone. It's a long road.
No, that's right. So step 4 is getting serious about a new regional security organization or framework that involves Iran,
right.
that involves Syria, that is grappling with the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but also the other issues there. And by the way, I would add step 5 is we have to get out of Iraq.
Yeah, well,
part of settling the security situation is getting out of Iraq. And let me give you the step 6.
Okay.
which is what you were referring to, is simultaneously with this, the U.S. has to be addressing the global nuclear problem.
Right.
And that is the problem of the 26,000 existing nuclear weapons, almost half of which are in our possession. And the good news about this is there's a growing consensus among the candidates that we have to start a new campaign for global nuclear disarmament. John McCain just endorsed this in his March 26 speech at Los Angeles, said it's time to reaffirm the goal of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's time for the U.S. to lead a global effort for nuclear disarmament. So when you hear John McCain saying this, that really opens up a lot of political space. And if Barack Obama is the President of the United States next year, and I think the odds are right now that he will be, he's enthusiastically endorsed it, and he's just the guy that can play out this complex multi-dimensional strategy.
Right.
Dealing with Iran, yes. Dealing with the regional security, yes. And also dealing with the global nuclear threat issue. All of that helps restore our credibility and legitimacy.
So see, if the U.S. implements the Jackie Joe plan, then we really can credibly say you don't need those crappy little centrifuges that aren't really doing you much good. Frankly, I mean, look.
And that's where we get to it. We get to it down the road.
Exactly.
So we don't make them give them up at first.
But in the meantime, you could insist that
it falls of its own logic. They become less and less important.
Exactly. Exactly. Because that's the whole point of it. It's to sort of remove this as an issue. And frankly, 6,000, 9,000, 25,000 P1 centrifuges working kind of muddling through are never going to be valuable for a reactor fuel program. But, hey, they could do some damage if you wanted to, you know the rest.
Absolutely. So, you do want to address this. The key is that you don't have to address it up front. Iran doesn't have to agree to shut them down, either temporarily or permanently, and the U.S. doesn't have to agree to accept them, either temporarily or permanently. You push that issue a little bit down the road. And I agree with you. As you get this process going, as you have these other dynamics operating in the region and globally, you can address the nuclear enrichment problem.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would suggest
2 years into it.
If the carrots are sweet enough, organic and farmers market fresh enough, then I would really think, as a gesture of good faith, and to remove this, that Iran really could, in a face-saving kind of way, turn off the electricity at Natanz and move forward to build all those reactors it says it needs.
I think that's exactly right. And our chances of making that deal would be enhanced if Ahmadinejad loses the presidential election next March, which I think he will at this point. He's wildly unpopular, hasn't delivered on his economic or anti-corruption program. There's a real good chance that he won't be president come April of 2009.
All right, so we've completely solved the biggest problem, Joe, in
Let's
30
write this
minutes.
memo up and get it to the candidates as soon as possible.
Right away. We'll get it to the transition teams. It's done. It's figured out. Was there anything else on our list we needed to talk about?
I think we've pretty much we've covered the ground so far. I think that'll do it for today.
All right. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Jackie. A pleasure as always.
You take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.